on Cisco for the afternoon, and I'm going to offer the opposite kind of disclaimer that Todd did, right? So what I'm here to do is try to represent the view of the group. It's not necessarily my personal view, but as a member of the technical committee. So a little bit of a different context. Nonetheless, there is a time where I'm going to put on my Fish and Wildlife Service hat to talk about specifically some of the activities that the service has been involved in, really in coordination with the technical committee as it relates to the implementation of the study. So one of the things that I think is important to do is to kind of reframe what it is that the technical committee had proposed and the Lake Committee had approved in terms of the study design back in 2015. So I think it's important to kind of revisit that for the audience. And then move in to talk a little bit about the planning and activities that we've undertaken since that time. Talk a little bit about timelines and perhaps some of the other implications that I think are important to the managers relative to the source populations for the study. So we'll get into that a little bit more as well. So, which one? Okay, so I think we're good here. So I'm going to start by saying that, you know, as a study, it certainly had an experimental component to it, right, as a design. Things we wanted to test. But at its heart, we recognize that really to guide future actions as it relates to Cisco restoration, you know, we feel that this type of stocking study is really a necessary component to really allow us to learn. You know, we're obviously in the very early stages of thinking about Cisco restoration, and we still have a long way to go to learn. But it's also important to recognize that this is built on really a long history of work, and the technical committee had promoted this idea back in the mid-2000s, shortly thereafter the collapse of Alewife, and at which time I was not a member of the committee. So I'm going to kind of step us through maybe just the framework of the study, just to orient folks. So really our goal here is to determine whether through stocking that we can establish a local population of Cisco. And the focus is Saginaw Bay. I think you've seen some reference to the historical importance of Saginaw Bay as it relates to Cisco production. There's pretty strong evidence that those spawning runs of Cisco back in Walter Kelce's time, that Saginaw Bay was an important place for Cisco. And so what I've done here is, I'm probably going to screw this up. Yep. Let's see if we can get that back. Round one. Which one is the pointer?
Top one?
Top one's pointer. Okay. Well, I'll just talk about them before we actually blow something up here. So really these circles represent, you've seen some of this already. These circles represent where, you know, most of the Cisco that we know are found in Lake Huron. So probably those stocks we know the most about are here in this confluence of the North Channel, Potagannissing Bay, Drummond Island, over to Lake in the St. Mary's River. So those are probably the populations that we know most about. Certainly Georgian Bay, you've seen some evidence from Tim's slide on the acoustic survey that Cisco are encountered here. That's probably an area where we know a little bit less about in terms of the spawning dynamics of those populations. So the Saginaw Bay is certainly spatially segregated from these stocks. It was historically important to Cisco, so it seemed to us kind of the logical place where we would want to try to implement this study. We also think it provides still nursery habitat to Cisco as well. So in terms of the approach, so what the approach in the study was that we would use two distinct morphotypes, right? You've heard now discussions, you've seen Randy's presentation on what these morphotypes are, and we use the term morphotype in the study, but I think implicit in our hypothesis was indeed that these were different animals, whether you want to call them ecomorphotypes or ecotypes. I mean, that was part of our hypothesis is that, or what certainly we want to test, is whether our nearshore forms of Cisco, right? So we're calling them nearshore, kind of air quotes, maybe coastal, but maybe the idea is non-migratory or certainly more sedentary relative to some of the things that we've seen from that Daniel presented for Lake Superior, which we would think of more as the offshore migratory form. So these are different behaviors, maybe different life histories that I think are important. And part of what we propose to test is really their performance and to try to evaluate what approach is appropriate for restoration. Our initial target was the fingerling stage of 375,000 of each type, so a total of 750,000 animals. That was a preliminary target that was identified. So what were the objectives? There's some based in really kind of the more evaluation component, which would be really to look at relative survival, habitat preference of these distinct morphotypes or ecomorphotypes, and to assess whether stock Cisco return to the spawning location during the spawning season. Probably a little hard. One of the questions that's still outstanding is whether these animals home, or maybe these different morphotypes home. But ultimately, it's really to assess our ability to reestablish a naturally reproducing stock of Cisco in a place where it's functionally extirpated. There are routine surveys in Saginaw Bay on an annual basis. Cisco are not encountered, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So it's really an open template or tablet, if you will, for us to consider such a program. But it's also important for us to understand what it takes to do this on a production scale. So that's also an objective. Okay, some key decision steps in the process. In March 2015, the LHC made a decision to support the study objectives, and they agreed on the use of a Lake Huron source in the experimental design. At that time, there was not concurrence on the use of any non-Huron source fish to fill that, what the typical arctide role. And part of that was a desire to really see the results of the panel that, if you were here in the first part of the morning, that Chuck Bronte mentioned for the Lake Michigan Native Plankton Task Group. So there was a link there between those efforts that were ongoing. But I think importantly too for the service, between that time, in January 2016, there was a letter from the LHC actually requesting that the service pursue the feasibility of Cisco stocking in the federal hatchery system. That's a pretty important thing, and that represents the ask to us from the management community, and really gives us the rationale for moving forward with programs such as this. In the interim, at the 2016 Summer Tech Committee meeting, we had reviewed the results of the panel that was convened as part of the Lake Michigan Native Plankton Task Group, and we responded to the LHC, providing our rationale for the use of the Western Lake Superior source in the study design. So this is kind of where we are relative to the implementation of the study. So I'm going to focus at least a little bit on what we've done since then, and this is still an outstanding question, something that we hope the Lake Huron Committee can discuss in their executive session, and we want to provide some context for our rationale. But I do want to talk a little bit about this part of it, because it is also part of the study, and it was something that we could move forward with as the service to try to begin getting a little bit ahead of the game, if you will, because we have a lot to learn still. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lake Huron Cisco populations, what we know, what we don't know or didn't know at the time. So prior to 2015, most of the contemporary information, you've probably seen these dots before. They represent in many ways some of the information that you've already seen presented from Randy Eschenroder on the morphometry. The early work actually by Dan Newell represented populations from St. Mary's River, Drummond Island, and North Channel. Is that correct, Dan? Okay. So these were kind of a bit of more of our known commodity as it relates to these forms. As Randy Eschenroder had pointed out, they certainly in line with these deeper bodied Elvis type forms. And so this, I put a little yellow dot there because that was actually, the St. Mary's River was actually the location where the Michigan Department of Natural Resources did their pilot study on Cisco egg tape. That was done in the latter part of the 2000s. So there's a little bit even more information from that population. We had things like age and size, structure of the morphometry, genetics. Randy Eschenroder had pointed in his talks some of that there is some stock structuring with Cisco in these Lake Huron populations, and certainly some information on the spawning period. But we did know that there were likely other aggregations that we thought it was, areas that we should still investigate as potential sources for Lake Huron, for the Huron form study. And those are represented by the black circles that have just appeared. Those include Potagannissing Bay here, and then the Lake Chanel Islands. Sorry for my shaky hand, too much coffee this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our investigation since then has suggested about these additional aggregates, but then in the whole about these Lake Huron population. So Potagannissing Bay, really, this was kind of something we did. We had a couple of days here and there, and we were able to devote some work to looking at Cisco populations. There was some historical information, but not a lot of contemporary information on where these aggregations might occur. But so what we did was really the goal is kind of that snapshot approach to try to look at could we locate Cisco. We went there once in September and once in November. In September we didn't capture any Cisco at any locations. In November we captured Cisco at all the locations. So some of which were referenced in historic. So there is this tendency, it seems that these animals do have the whether they home or what the mechanism is, they do appear to show up at these same places during the spawning season. So the Cisco appear to be pretty widespread, and we were able to gather information on and really add to that body of knowledge as it relates to genetics. Those data haven't been processed yet, but also looking at morphometry, and things like size and age structure, kind of this feasibility test, if you will, to see if gamete collection might be a possibility here. Where we spent a little more time is actually Lake Chanel Islands. This is pilot work we did for 2 years, beginning in 2015. I'd say in 2015, in the Lake Chanels, we were about the same place we were in 2016 in the Potagannissing. We had some information, but we tried to verify those spawning aggregates. And we actually used that information in 2016 to do actual gamete collections. I don't know why I said live. Dead gamete collections wouldn't be too effective. So we kind of treated it as it was live, right? Like we were looking at what it would take to do this to support the study. But the idea here was that we could use these collections to help support brood development. So that's what we were able to do in 2016. We successfully collected 63 spawning pairs to support brood development, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this just shows the distribution of where we were able to collect spawning pairs in the Lake Chanel. So we really tried to provide a fairly broad spatial coverage and temporal coverage, but it is not easy to do, right? So not easy to do. Those places look pretty close, but on November 23rd, that's a long way to go 3 miles, right? So as folks from MDNR can attest, this takes a little bit of doing. So, but this just represents the areas. We saw a couple areas certainly where densities were higher. So what does it suggest, or what do we know now about these spawning populations? We have information on the size composition, the age structure of the population, additional information like morphometry. Of course, you've already seen that. Fecundity, so in some fish health characteristics as well. So we've really been able to I think, increase the body of knowledge as it relates to these animals in Lake Huron. And we see a pretty broad age structure in the population, and maybe some evidence for this 2009 year class that Dan mentioned in Lake Cisco here. Okay, what else can we say about these populations? It appears, I don't think we can be completely definitive about this, but it appears that the spawning period is fairly narrow. I offer the dates here that we think peak spawning occurred, well, maybe all the spawning occurred. In 2015, roughly, we saw a first right female on November 17th. By November 23rd, all the females were spent. In 2016, on November 20th, we saw the first right female. We stopped operations on the 25th, and that was, it worked through Thanksgiving, and both the crew and boat were done. The fish weren't, but we started to already see spent females in this population by 25th. So it seems like there's this fairly truncated period. When we captured both right females and males, it was always adjacent to rocky substrate. And I think the spawning period here seems to be indicative of the populations in Lake Huron. Maybe we can't say that with certainty because you have to keep going out to be able to prove that. But that certainly seems to be the pattern. So a little bit about the service in terms of what it's doing in in terms of the infrastructure. I mentioned that we did these collections. They serve now as with that first kind of brood line for Cisco, and they are in isolation at our Genoa National Fish Hatchery. So these are actually some pictures. I've, up until this point, had to use pictures that Wendy Stott would provide me for the Cisco that we collected, so I'm happy to be able to present our own pictures here from the third hatchery. So this is actually the isolation facility at Genoa, and I'm going to just leave that kind of so far so good with these 2016 collections, but they're there for an 18-month cycle. It's part of the brood stock management for the service. So that's the isolation facility for brood, but in terms of production, those capital improvements have been ongoing at the Jordan River National Fish Hatchery. And so this has been a parallel track, and it's not just about Cisco for the service, but we're looking at really a Corriganine, program, if you will. Cisco might be the dominant player, but they might be just one part of the mix. And also it's a regional program as well, planning for some level of production in 2018. So next steps, we're going to continue to work on the operational plan that Arun has pointed out. We're going to then continue to go out and do gamete collections in 2017 to support both production and brood. But I think then to take the next step in implementation, what we're asking for then is that decision on the typical R&D source population. So that's where I really want to talk a little bit now. I think I'm going to move forward past the timeline, other than to say we have about a 10-year timeline for stocking, and it's going to take us at least 3 to 5 years before we can have any really good evaluation. So I really just wanted to point out that the timeline that we're talking about here. So what do we know about Lake Huron source populations? Well, as we continue to look, nearly all the evidence suggests that we don't have a typical Ardidite analog in Lake Huron. There's some recent information, certainly that you've seen that Randy offered, and Tim also offered in terms of the ecology. So maybe there is something in terms of Georgian Bay that is worth considering. But I think what we could conclude from that, though, is that the population is likely not large. So I think you run into similar issues as it relates to the feasibility. And so I'm going to address that in the next slide. And most of these, the Lake Huron populations do seem to share similar characteristics. So in terms of the typical Arnodide population, Western Lake Superior, that source fits the ecological profile of interest to round out the study. That more migratory form, and I offer here the map, one of the maps that Dan had in his presentation. It really kind of tells the story, at least in contrast to what I'm going to show next for Lake Huron. It's a large effective population size. It's also a known commodity, and there's kind of this fishery infrastructure that exists, right? We don't have that in Lake Huron. These are fairly small populations. So as we consider some of the management implications, Chuck Bronte mentioned in his talk to this evaluation of risk. And so what I'd like to offer is at least either an addition or perhaps an emphasis on what that means. So we think about risk or hazard analysis as both being a probability, having a probability, and then some magnitude. So both those things are important in trying to determine what's the right approach. And in this case, we think about the probability of some adverse impact on maybe our existing stocks, right? Through outbreeding depression and loss of local fitness. And I think we would challenge the managers to think about the probability and the magnitude. But we'd also offer that this idea that maybe the risk of inaction as it relates to bringing in a Lake Superior source would be to consider this idea of perhaps having a void in the trophic ecology of the lake. That in itself might represent some level of risk. So we think of a balanced thought process as it relates to the management of risk is an important consideration for the managers. So I'm going to end there. I obviously went through my time, so